Ours is very simple.
Right.
What it's doing is removing that immunity clause, basically saying you are responsible for your actions of censorship, adverse actions that are not warranted. What it does is I think it brings it back into the age of accountability.
Congressman Gosar, such a pleasure to have you back on American Thought Leaders.
Thanks, John.
Of course, I've been telling everybody the fist pump because, coronavirus has gotten into the U.S. now. We know that, and better to be on the safe side.
Yeah, when you handshake, you're passing off germs.
Absolutely.
And so people ought to just be very common sense. Wash your hands repeatedly.
Absolutely.
Keep yourself healthy, wealthy and wise, and I think you'll do just fine.
So let's talk about something really important to you, and frankly important to me as well. Of course, related to the First Amendment. Abuse of the Communications Decency Act, or at least as some people see it, right? That's how you've certainly framed it in the past. Tell me a bit about what you're seeing happening.
So for background for people, what ends up happening is when the platforms like Google and Facebook were made, they were given a broad immunity from prosecution, from liability. And now they've morphed, instead of just being platforms, they're now publishers. And what they're doing is they're censoring people like myself, like Laura Loomer and others. And there's a cost to that. You can't do that with the public square. And so we have tried to look at how do we break this up so that it is fair, not just to them, but to the individual's rights. So we've actually put legislation that is separate of the antitrust aspect of breaking them up. And what this basically says that is you as a subscriber, if you buy the product and they're giving you that product uncensored, if you find that you're being censored, you have the ability to go back and sue, utilizing our current law setup to hire an attorney and sue them. That doesn't impugn on our First Amendment. It doesn't impugn on their liability because they have inherent liability as a publisher. And so we think it's a happy medium that will actually get us from point one to point two. And you add in the antitrust application, and I think you got a fair application to where the Facebooks and the Googles of the world are now made more compliant without violating our Constitution.
So does this involve in any way redefining how the platforms are identified? Because that's one of these kind of debates, right? Of course, publisher or platform.
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean, once again, they've admitted as much, for example, in Laura Loomer's case, they've admitted in her lawsuit case that they are a publisher. And once again, the immunity was given to them as a platform, not as a publisher. And so you either believe in the First Amendment or you don't. And you got to make sure that you're standing up for it, but not impugning the rest of the Constitution in order to have that freedom of speech.
So why do you feel additional legislation is needed if they see themselves
ours
as a
is
publisher?
very simple.
Right.
What it's doing is removing that immunity clause, basically saying you are responsible for your actions of censorship, adverse actions that are not warranted. What it does is I think it brings it back into the age of accountability.
How far is this along at this point?
Well, we've introduced it. We've had a number of conversations with Democratic colleagues. You see the conversation in the Senate. You've seen Rand Paul, you've seen Tom Cotton, you've seen Ted Cruz, you've seen Rick Scott, all starting to talk about this because in the last election you saw 2.4 million votes being moved to Hillary Clinton through these platforms. What Facebook and these platforms have said is they're willing to see 15.5 million votes being skewed to anybody who runs against President Trump. That's not the way we ought to be doing that. There should be impugned problems when you violate the law.
So you're referring to Dr. Robert Epstein's research?
Absolutely,
okay.
Absolutely. Here's the guy who's probably the most talented, most studied person in regards to the platforms. And you can't have the continuation of an unfair playing field. Not even to start looking at the up and coming platforms that have been impugned by those currently performing platforms, keeping them at bay, not getting the same type of application.
Well, so this research basically just says that the potential exists, right, to shift votes like that.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that that's what's going to happen.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
But but when you see the process of how they actually can engage voters, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out how you get all this little location to pony up with a bunch of votes.
So, this is what I've been hearing, and especially in some progressive circles and so forth, and at Facebook in general. There's the people, some of the staff, I actually think that Mark Zuckerberg is trying to re-elect the president. This is what people are saying in the company, because he seems like he's taking a stance for freedom of speech. This is kind of the things that have been told to me. I don't know if you're familiar with this at all.
Well, I always make the comment, talk is cheap, actions speak. And if you want to get back to a real marketplace, adhere to the Constitution and the public square. I think our legislation is perfectly something that Mr. Zuckerberg and every other platform individual can get behind.
Okay, and so what would you recommend to these platforms outside of, let's say, signing on to your bill and supporting it? What would you recommend to them, in the coming months?
Well,
to be the true public square.
Yeah, I think they have to monitor themselves and say, listen, does this truly meet the definition that should be censored? And then if they're going to censor somebody in this meantime, they ought to address them point blank and say, this is what we found offensive. This is why we did this. This is what you subscribe to as a subscriber. This is why we took this as an offense. Validate your actions, define them, but be accountable.
Congressman Gosar, such a pleasure to have you on the show.
John, thank you.